Thank you so much for coming. It is wonderful to be here for the final event in our series. And we have a fascinating evening ahead of us. You know, 40 years ago, hardly anyone talked about mindfulness, even though there were certainly plenty of people who meditated back then. And if you had a taste for Eastern exoticism, maybe you dabbled in yoga as well, but there wasn't a science of mindfulness back then. The idea of mindfulness, the idea that it could be studied by modern Western science, in fact, that your mental activity could actually change the physical structure of your brain, was a revolutionary idea. Paradigm shift is an overused phrase, but that would seem to be the case in this instance. And especially with the discovery of neuroplasticity and with the insights made possible by new brain imaging techniques. And of course, what makes the new science of mindfulness so meaningful is it's not just about what happens in the lab. It's about you and me. It's about your anxiety and your resilience, about your well-being, your happiness. And it's about learning specific things that you can do to actually make your life better. So we have a lot to talk about, a terrific panel with some of the true pioneers in the field. We'll talk for about an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So let me introduce our speakers. Richard Davidson is director of the Weissman Brain Imaging Lab and the Lab for Effective Neuroscience, and the founder and chair of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin. He's collaborated with the Dalai Lama and many others to study the neuroscience of meditation. He's a co-author of the recent book, The Emotional Life of Your Brain. Amishi is a professor of psychology and director of contemplative neuroscience, mindfulness research, and practice initiative at the University of Miami. Her research investigates attention and working memory, and she's investigating how mindfulness training can help various populations, including members of the U.S. military. Jon Kabat-Zinn is an emeritus professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, where he was the founding executive director of the Center for Mindfulness in Medicine, Healthcare, and Society. He was also the founder and former director of the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Clinic. His many books include Full Catastrophe Living, Using the Wisdom of Your Body and Mind to Face Stress, Pain, and Illness. A great title, by the way. So, Richie, let me start with you. Is the science of mindfulness changing our understanding of the way the brain works?
I think that it's beginning to change the way we think about the brain. As you mentioned in your introduction, Steve, we now have evidence that engaging in pure mental training can induce changes not just in the function of the brain, but in the brain's very structure itself. And I think these are the first examples that we've had of how top-down control. It's a phrase that psychologists and neuroscientists use, and what we mean by top-down control is conscious volitional activity that we can engage in by our will, if you will. And through that process, through this conscious volitional kind of mental training, what we find is that the brain can actually change, and that some of those changes may be beneficial and useful. And so this is giving us, I think, a new way to think about, from one perspective, how the brain can reorganize itself.
I mean, this is a radical idea when you think about it. You're saying that through mental activity itself, from the way we think, that actually rewires our brain in some way. It's laying down new neural circuits, Jon?
Well, I'm sitting between two neuroscientists, but let me make it clear, I am not a neuroscientist. So when no other neuroscientists are available, I will talk about the brain. But let me just say that one way of looking at the brain is that it is the organ of experience. And so it was basically developed to regulate how we are in relationship to every aspect of our experience. And if you think about it for a moment, how do we experience anything? Well, there's the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue. Without those, we wouldn't be experiencing much, would you agree? And then there are other senses, like something called proprioception, something called interoception. Like proprioception is, I can't see my hand, but I know where it is. I know exactly where it is, and then I can move it however I want, bring it right to the center of my mouth. Interoception is, you get asked how you're doing, and you say, fine. How do you know? How quickly did you assess things? Well, that's the sense of interoception. And it turns out that we're beginning to understand how the brain organizes itself to actually optimize our effective functioning in relationship to a very, very complex and rapidly changing world. By the way, the brain has been doing this for millennia. It's not just since the advent of neuroscience. I mean, it's we who are the ignorant ones. The brain has been way out in front of the curve from the beginning, wouldn't you agree? So we're trying to figure it out.
The idea of neuroplasticity, I mean, we all take this for granted now, but it's actually a relatively new idea.
And that's
right?
because there was, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a kind of dogma in neuroscience for a very long time that after about the age of 2, it was all downhill in the brain and central nervous system. You just lost neurons at a kind of increasingly exponential rate. And it turns out that that's not actually true. So, and that was a relatively recent discovery. And beyond that, I'll let Richie and Amishi.
Well, Amishi, let me bring you into the discussion. I mean, neuroplasticity, how much can the brain actually change as we age?
I think it's interesting to think about this as a radical idea, because at some level, based on the history of the field of neuroscience, it is pretty new. But on the other hand, if I asked, how many of you think that engaging in certain kinds of physical activity will change the way the body works? Like, raise your hands if you think that's true. Okay, that's our cultural understanding now, is that specific types of activity can alter the body in noticeable ways. If you sprint, you're going to have different leg muscles develop than if you decide to do, crunches. And I think that it's very similar. We're coming to the point, and at least this is my hope, that we'll get to the point where, as a society, as a culture, sort of across the globe, we'll start getting that the mind is really no different than the body, that engaging in very specific exercises can promote health, and indeed engaging in regular mental activity of certain sorts will promote this health.
And is that true throughout the course of our life? I mean, whether we are 10 years old, 30 years old, 70 years old?
Well, go ahead, Amishi.
Yes.
We know that plasticity changes over the course of life, but we also know that plasticity never ceases. And there's definitive evidence that plasticity exists until we die. We know the research which actually demonstrated that neurogenesis, which is the growth of new neurons, a form of plasticity, that neurogenesis exists in the human brain, was done among people who were actually very close to death, because in order to definitively look at neurogenesis, you need to look literally inside the brain. And so we needed to look at people who were close to the end of their life. And so those data show that plasticity exists throughout life. But I do think that there's an important lesson that can be harnessed in our basic understanding of developmental changes in plasticity, because there is no question that for certain kinds of skills, the brain is more plastic early in life. That is why it's much easier to learn a second language when you're a young kid. It's why it's easier to learn to play a musical instrument when you're a young child. And if we can actually figure out ways to cultivate skills of mindfulness and related practices early in life, it's possible that those skills will be more enduring and will lead to more lasting kinds of changes. That is speculation at this point. We don't know the answer to that, but it invites that kind of question.
Now, there's often a personal story as to why a scientist chooses a particular field of study. And I'm guessing, in this case in particular, there are some interesting personal stories. So I want to ask each of you, why did you first get interested in mindfulness? John, let me start with you.
Well, you know how it is with stories. I mean, you can tell the story of yourself in 1,000 different ways, depending on the effect you want to get across and to who you're talking to and everything else. So I don't believe any of the stories that I tell myself about my past and the arc of my trajectory. But I do find myself sometimes saying that this was something that I appreciated very young, maybe 5 or so, just living in my family, which my father happened to be a professor at Columbia in the medical school, and my mother was an artist. My father was extremely well known in scientific circles. My mother was a complete unknown. She had her first, she paints, she had her first show when she was 90 years old. Wow. She's now 98 and a half. So I grew up in this sort of C.P. Snow's two cultures, science and art, and I just knew that there was something missing. I could feel it in the sort of emotional tenor of the family. And so it became really important to me to understand for myself, what is the unifying factor of different ways of knowing? Now at 5, I probably wouldn't have put it that way, but it was kind of like a cellular feeling that there's got to be more to it than this. So as I trained at MIT in molecular biology and so forth, that was always like at the front of my motivation, was like, you have to start with physics and chemistry and molecular biology, but what about complexity? What about consciousness? So that was something that I was literally always interested in. And then at MIT, I got introduced to Buddhist meditation. I won't tell the story, but it was like I was 22 years old, and it was a wake-up experience. It was, holy smoke, this is what I've been looking for my entire life, a way of being that allows us to hold everything without judging it, without putting it into compartments and cognitive sort of bins, but to just hold it all and then see relationships that might have been opaque when we were, in some sense, using filters to actually do the seeing. So to, in some sense, take off the usual filters that we have and then perceive things directly as they are. So that made a huge difference. And from that point on, even though I did get my PhD in molecular biology, there was always this, this other element that was very important to me. And that's what I finally wound up figuring out how to do as my both profession and as my, love.
Richie, let me turn to you. How did you get interested in mindfulness?
Well, for really at the start of my career, and still very much this is true today, I've been captured in terms of my scientific interests by the diversity among people in how they respond to life's slings and arrows. As the bumper sticker says, stress happens. Stuff happens. Not exactly what it says. And it's really all about our relationship to these challenges. And I've been always interested in why certain people are vulnerable and other people are resilient. And this has been at the core of my scientific interests. And I always had the conviction that we can do better as a society, and that the mind really was central to this, and that we don't have to accept the status quo. And when I had the opportunity very early on in my career to meet a number of people who had been engaged in meditation practice, I was able to feel something about their demeanor, feel something about the way they related to life slings and arrows. And I said, that is something that is really important. And I could just see it in the quality of their being.
And I know you were a grad student in psychology at Harvard at the time, but then you started hanging out with people who had gone off to India and people who were serious meditators,
people
right?
Outside of William James Hall, some of whom were fired from William James Hall. Yeah, that was my alternative source of education, and a very important complement. I learned a lot from those people, and that really kindled my interest.
Amishi, how did you get interested in this?
Well, my story's on the lowbrow end of how people come to these things. But both of these great mentors of mine were part of the story. And I'll just say that the the basic motivation for me was stress. You were at Harvard, you were at MIT, I was at the University of Pennsylvania as a professor, just starting out, building my lab with 2 young kids, teaching classes, developing the lab, and I had lost feeling in my teeth from grinding. I just couldn't talk anymore, and that's not a good thing when you're a professor, and you have to give lectures and you can't speak. And right around that time, I don't even know if I've ever shared this with Richie, but Richie was giving a talk at Penn, and he showed these images of electrical activity in the brain, of a brain that was primarily in a negative affective state, negative mood, and its electrical profile, and another brain that was in a relatively positive mood and its electrical profile. And they were quite different from each other. So at the end of his talk, it was a big auditorium, lots of people. I raised my hand and I said, practical question, how do you get that brain to look like that brain? And he said, meditation. And that was it. He didn't elaborate. And I was like, I can't believe he just used that word in this audience. At that point, it was just not something I ever had heard in a scientific context. But it stuck with me, and then when I was struggling with my own problems with stress, I decided I was going to check out this meditation thing as an alternative to just completely quitting my job. My husband suggested I might try something before doing that. And so I took the summer and I started doing this just myself in my office. Mindfulness for Beginners, I think it was called Mindfulness for Beginners by Jack Kornfield, a little guided CD. So I committed to spending a period of time where I would just do this. And after a couple of months, it was really weird. I still had a lab, I still had my kids, I still had a busy, active life, but I felt totally different in my relationship to it and felt much more present and stable to what my experience was instead of feeling in the throes of it. And at the same time, I realized, oh my goodness, I actually have the tools in my own scientific toolbox to study this. And it would be a lot more fun to study this than the kind of basic research that I was doing. How could we actually engage in training techniques that would improve the way that the brain is able to function and pay attention? So in many ways, it's in the same spirit of what Richie was saying, is we can do better. In my case, it was like, I can do better. I was better able to function, and I was deeply curious about what was happening. And I'm a basic attention researcher, so I had a lot of the paradigms and technologies that I already had access to, and I started applying these to questions around the impact of mindfulness training. Wrote my first grant by the end of that summer, and haven't stopped since. It's been good. So thank you.
So we've been throwing around this word, mindfulness, and I think we need a definition here. What does it mean to be mindful?
Well, there are a lot of different doors into this room. So it's one is an operational definition. In other words, how do you cultivate mindfulness? And my working definition in that vein is its awareness. Mindfulness is the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. And the non-judgmental piece got mentioned in the introduction as being potentially of great value, but it's very easy to misunderstand what non-judgmental means. Non-judgmental means suspending judgment, but it doesn't mean you won't have any judgments. And you have to force yourself to be non-judgmental, but more that you don't judge how judgmental you are, which once you start to pay attention is colossal. How many ideas and opinions and likes and dislikes and everything actually drive us literally from moment to moment so that we can be lost in thought, lost in our heads, caught up in emotional storms and not be actually living our lives in the only moment we ever have, which is this one. So that's the operational definition. Now, there are two different ways that I use and my colleagues use, but there are two different ways to think about this in the larger sense, because awareness, I don't want to get into the question of how does awareness differ from consciousness, for instance, but awareness is a very interesting faculty that we all have, that if you stop and think about it for a moment, can you experience being aware right now in this moment? Of course you can. And you can be aware of various aspects of experience. And as I said, there are many through the senses and also through the body as a whole and through the mind, through the faculty of attention and awareness itself. So there are many different doors into this, and one is, could we try as a little exercise, just as a game you could say, to just say pick one object that we would attend to, and then see what happens if you decide, whoever the you is that tells the other parts of you to do things, that you decide, I'm going to just feel my breath and be aware of my breath for, say, the next 3 minutes or 5 minutes. And we won't do it. And if you're out there driving, listening in the car, don't close your eyes for this. But you might feel the breath come in and feel the breath come out. So it's not thinking about the breath, but very, very rapidly, inevitably, you will notice that your mind drifts off into something else. The past, the future, opinions, ideas, memories, anticipations. And so the breath is no longer in evidence. So then when you notice that, and sooner or later you will, then you come back to the breath. So it's like exercising a muscle. It's like the mind goes off, bring it back. Mind goes off, you bring it back to the object that you're paying attention to. It doesn't have to be the breath. It could be virtually anything. But then slowly over time, mind goes off, and you're having such a good time in your own space fantasy or whatever, you don't want to bring it back. This is where the rubber meets the road. You bring it back anyway. Just for fun. Just for fun, against all the resistance, and I don't want to do this, and it's getting boring, and all of that kind of, which is all thinking. You bring it back anyway because part of you decided you were just going to do this and see what would come of it if you did. So that's one door into it, is to use objects to pay attention to. But let me just say that that could easily convey the impression that it's the objects of attention that are most important. And it's not the objects of attention, the breath or the body as a whole or this technique or that technique. That's not what's most important. What is most important is the attending itself. So can we pay attention to attention? Can we bring awareness to awareness? And one way that you can do that is to actually practice being present without focusing or choosing a particular object to attend to. Just rest in awareness itself. That turns out to be quite a challenging thing to do, but in essence no more challenging than staying with the breath. They're both very, very difficult. But there are many, many different doors into this room, and the really important thing is not to think one's better than another, but to actually don't stand in the doorway, but enter the room.
I want to bring the neuroscience perspective in this. So, Richie, you have watched people in brain scanning machines as they are practicing mindfulness. What's going on in the brain?
Well, lots of things are going on, and it's not something that we can summarize easily for a few reasons. One is it depends on whether it's a person who's just starting out to do this, or we bring in someone who's done 35,000 hours of lifetime practice. What that person shows and what a novice shows may be quite different. It will differ as a function of, even though what I think Jon said is really important in terms of what we measure in the brain, if you are using your breath as an object of focus versus using an external visual stimulus, there'll be somewhat different parts of the brain that are involved. The one thing we could say is that networks that are important for attention are engaged by these practices, and we can say in certain ways strengthened.
Which parts of the brain are activated?
Well, particularly the regions in the prefrontal cortex, which play a very important role in aspects of attention. But again, it depends upon a person's level of expertise. We've seen in very expert practitioners that the prefrontal cortex comes online for very brief periods of time, but then goes back down to baseline, and it corresponds, we think, to reports that these practitioners give of being able to rest in awareness in the way Jon was describing it completely effortlessly. They don't need to, in a kind of effortful way, yank the mind back, because it is just that space, if you will, is more familiar. And the word meditation, by the way, in Sanskrit, one of the definitions literally means familiarization. And it is a person becoming more and more familiar with this quality of awareness that Jon was talking about.
Now, I know you have asked very experienced meditators, particularly Buddhist monks, to come into your lab, and you have watched them. And sometimes these are people who have spent literally tens of thousands of hours meditating over the course of their lives. What have you seen in these? I think you've described them as sort of like the Olympic athletes of meditation. What have you noticed in them?
Well, in that work, first of all, we see very different patterns with different kinds of meditation practice. So we've been talking about mindfulness. There are many varieties of mindfulness practice that these folks engage in. There are also practices that are designed to explicitly cultivate certain kinds of positive qualities like compassion and loving kindness. And we see differences depending upon what practices that they're doing. One of the things that we noticed early on when people are doing a basic mindfulness practice, particularly the kind that Jon described, where they're not choosing a specific object, but just resting in awareness, in these long-term practitioners, is they exhibit an oscillation in the brain that we call gamma oscillations, particularly in the prefrontal region, but we see it across widespread regions of the brain. These gamma oscillations are high-frequency oscillations that are recorded with brain electrical measurement. They are oscillations of about 40 cycles per second, and they've been implicated in basic neuroscientific research in synaptic plasticity, in basic mechanisms of plasticity. One of the things that we see is that these oscillations are highly synchronized across widespread regions of the brain. We also see that when an external stimulus is presented, these oscillations become phase-locked to the external stimulus. And what that means, it best described as in a metaphorical way, if you can imagine a very, very still lake and you throw a stone in the lake, you'll be able to easily see the ripples that that stone will produce, even if you're standing on the other shore of the lake. Whereas if the lake is turbulent, throwing a stone in, you won't see any effect. If the mind is turbulent, when you introduce an external stimulus, it's going to be part of this turbulent gamish that is the stuff of our mind. But if the mind is more quiet, you'll see this kind of phase locking where an external stimulus will lock onto a phase of the ongoing brain oscillations. And that may be a way in which the brain can enhance, if you will, the signal-to-noise ratio, largely by decreasing the noise, not so much enhancing the signal.
And would you say that that actually might be a kind of, if not biological model, at least a metaphor for an insight?
Yeah.
Or a particular kind of realization in the moment that that's a horse, or you know, any kind of insight at all? Is that what the phase locking gives you, is kind of a background, foreground kind of jumping out at you?
Yeah, I think that that's you know, a reasonable kind of speculation.
Amishi, you said that the reason why you got into this whole science of mindfulness is for very personal reasons. I mean, there was too much stress in your life.
That's the reason I got into it personally.
Personally,
There.
yes. What do we know about how mindfulness helps reduce stress? What's going on in the brain to reduce stress?
Well, I actually think it ties back to what you were asking about the definition of mindfulness, right? So I think Jon's description, I think this is the first time I've heard you say it was a definition. It's more like a description. Yeah. But it's actually operational definition. It's quite prophetic, because I'm just going to say it again. Paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Did I get it right?
Yep.
Okay. So the paying attention on purpose piece is essentially, in my mind, a hypothesis that maybe what'll change is our ability to voluntarily direct our attention. So if we think of the capacity of the mind and of attention kind of like a flashlight that you can direct it at will, well, maybe the capacity to direct it at will might be helped. And that could be really useful if your mind tends to move that flashlight in directions that aren't that useful. So for example, in the context of depression, constantly having that internal flashlight shine on depressogenic negative thoughts and feeling like you can't control it. If you were allowed to engage in activities and practices that could give you a better hold so that you could direct it where you wanted it to go. That could be helpful. So attention is one piece of that. The in a particular way and in the present moment, in my mind, when I hear that, and I'd say the field is sort of moving in this direction, it's a hypothesis about our ability to develop what we call meta-awareness, an awareness of what we are experiencing in the moment. What is happening right now? Right? So the quality of being able to know where my mind is. Am I wandering or am I here? Am I actually sitting in the chair or is my mind, somewhere else? So that's the meta-awareness piece. And then this last point about non-judgmentally, in my mind, I would say it really is about the kind of value-laden, affectively charged meaning we give to things, and that we might have some control over how much value we decide to give something. So if something happens and you say, this is the worst thing that could have ever happened, well, that's one meaning you're giving to what happened. What if there's another meaning, like this is the best thing that could have ever happened, or this is of no consequence? Those are all different judgments, so to speak, on an event.
So from the neuroscience perspective,
right?
Why do some people fall apart in
right,
a stressful situation, whereas other people somehow can ride it out? And
absolutely.
It doesn't get to them
these
so much.
three areas, right? Paying attention willfully, being able to be aware of what's going on, meta-aware, and not having so much having some control over the amount of meaning you put into something or how much self-relatedness there is to something, are all kind of vulnerable points in our life experience. So if we, for example, and by the way, excuse me, they represent sort of core mental functions that in the brain have limited capacity. So for example, our ability to pay attention willfully is a limited capacity thing. If you direct it a lot or use it up, you're not going to have a lot of control in your ability to use it willfully again. So in one way, when I think about stress, it could be that these people that are experiencing it, including me at that point in my life, were spent. They didn't have any more capacity to willfully guide what their mind did. They were really prone to the habits of mind. And same thing goes for meta-awareness. If we are spent in our ability to see what we're doing and feeling and thinking and experiencing, if we have no ability to actually experience, we're going to go on autopilot. We're not going to be mindful of our behavior. And then same thing with affective meaning. So I would say when I think about what are certain vulnerabilities and what does it mean to be stressed, it's typically, I would say the flip side of that would be to be resilient. So having the capacity to bounce back when things go wrong and having the capacity to maintain your functioning even when things are more and more stressful. So my question in the research, going back to your question about brain regions, what is that capacity is the question I was asking. And one place that I was looking was the human attention system. Most of the work.
Let me follow up on this, because I know, Richie, this is one of your areas of research is resilience. Actually trying to figure out what's happening in the brain so that people can be resilient. Have you figured this out?
Well, one specific example is the following. One way that we get ourselves into trouble sometimes is by perseverating over adversity. And so if we're confronted with a stress, we often have an emotional reaction that perseverates, that just goes on beyond the point where it's useful and goes on beyond the point where the stress is actually present. And one of the things that we find in the brain is that's expressed in prolonged activation in a particular part of the brain called the amygdala, which is very important for emotion and particularly for stress and negative emotions and anxiety. And so we've actually been able to measure the duration of time that the amygdala responds to a particular discrete emotional stimulus that we can present in the laboratory. And one of the things that we found is that practicing mindfulness will actually lead to faster recovery in the amygdala. The amygdala comes back down to baseline more quickly. So there's a response. It doesn't change the response itself, but what it does seem to do is it changes how quickly you recover. And that may be a key attribute of resilience.
And is this a long-term thing? I mean, sort of the more practice you have in mindfulness, the more resilient you naturally are?
Our data do indicate that there is, in fact, a correlation between the number of hours of formal practice and the rapidity with which the amygdala recovers in this particular way. Yeah.
Jon?
And part of it is to bring together some of what Richie and Amishi is saying, that if you take depression, for instance, major depressive disorder, or, just one of the most painful aspects of it is that the mind just keeps going over the same thing over and over and over again, the perseveration you were talking about. And you also believe the thoughts that your mind is secreting as the truth. You have no separation from them, as these are events in the field of awareness. They're events in the field of consciousness. But no, it's the truth. I'm a terrible person. I'm a failure. I'm too old. I'm too this. I'm too that. And we just believe that is the truth. When you cultivate mindfulness, what you're doing is you're adding another dimension to the picture. You're not trying to fix that, or you're not trying to fix anything or make anything go away. So in that sense, it's a very radical stance to take. What you're doing is expanding the field of awareness to hold your observing capacity as separate from what it is that's being observed. And then one kind of quick way to frame it is that when you see that you're not your thoughts or your emotions, then you have a whole palette of different ways to be in relationship to those thoughts or emotions. And that can break this vicious cycle of depressive rumination. And all of a sudden, and this shows itself in different areas of the brain. When people are trained in MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, before they're trained, there tends to be a lot of activity in what's called the default network, as I understand it, where, it's a narrative network about the story of me. And if the story of me is particularly depressing, well, it's an awful lot like that. Then when you train people in mindfulness, another lateral network shows up. It's not that this shuts down, but it does decrease. And that is a kind of non-narrative self-referencing. It's just, I'm here now, feeling my breath, feeling the body, standing, the air on my skin, or whatever. And it's related to different parts of the brain. That seems to give you a whole other way to be in relationship to the thinking part. Now, there's nothing wrong with thinking, but when thinking takes over and dominates our lives, and we become, as I said, lost in thought, or completely oppressed by thought, then we're oppressed, we're not free. And this gives us, this cultivation of mindfulness gives us a whole other dimension to be in wiser relationship to it.
But this is sort of fascinating. I mean, you're suggesting that to be truly mindful, we have to kind of get rid of the story that we tell about ourselves.
Not get rid of it. No, the languaging becomes very, very important here. It's not about getting rid of anything. It's more about cultivating different innate aspects of ourselves by, as Richie was saying, becoming more familiar with the territory. We're familiaring ourselves with the territory. It's as if we only shine the spotlight over here in a territory that's got at least 5 or 10 different dimensions. So when we tune into these different dimensions through the senses, through awareness itself, then we've got a whole way of being in relationship to thinking and to the narrative that is liberating, it's freeing. And here's the kind of take-home message is, if you want to reduce the stress in your life, then be aware of how much you tend to take personally things that actually aren't personal. Okay? We make them personal by our story of them, but actually it may just be the human condition, it may be life expressing itself. But if we create a big story of me, that big story of me, we may wind up being the first victims of it, so to speak, and believing it, even though, and it can be all true in one way, but it's just not a big enough story. And so what this is about, in some sense, is expanding the awareness and the narrative so that, if you've meditated for 50,000 hours or something like that, how you are in relationship to your life is very different from if you've been meditating for a week and a half.
I want to step back for a moment and talk about the way mindfulness is practiced, particularly in the United States, in the Western setting? Because I think I think a lot of people would say that originally it came through Buddhism, through Buddhist meditation, which then raises the question: is mindfulness in the modern Western sense an offshoot of Buddhism, or is it something else?
Well, do you mind my pointing out, it's a wonderful question, that the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist. So this question is actually kind of tricky. So we turned the Buddha into some big thing, but his fundamental teaching, you could think of him more as like a scientist, like the Galileo or an Einstein, somebody with very, very deep insight into the nature of his own experience, and developed the language and framework and methods and laboratory tools and so forth for doing it, which is what all these meditative practices are about. And yes, a religion grew up around it. But the religion is very interesting because, for one thing, there's no God. And, you know, it's like, just from our point of view, it's a kind of interesting thing. But from the point of view of mindfulness, although it is spoken of as the heart of Buddhist meditation, it's about paying attention. How Buddhist is that? It's about awareness. How Buddhist is that? It's about loving kindness. How Buddhist is that? Or compassion. So if we drop into its essence, which has always been its essence, then those kinds of questions become really second order. It's not like we're secretly trying to turn everybody into Buddhists. That's our hidden agenda.
Well, let me ask a more pointed question then. Is mindfulness a spiritual practice?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the word spiritual. I tend to stay away from the word spiritual as, you know, as if it had some kind of toxic outpouring. Because people get very attached to their view of spiritual, and then they put that in counter distinction to everybody else who's not quite as spiritual as I am. So my working definition of spiritual is what it means for us to be truly human. And I leave it at that. It's like, who knows? Do you know what I'm saying? But, well, is giving birth spiritual? Is chopping vegetables spiritual? Is seeing the look in your daughter's eye when she comes home from school, is that a spiritual experience or not good enough? Not really good enough. So, you know, from that point of view, what isn't spiritual? As long as we are bringing full, open-hearted presence and awareness to it, it's like then the world, in some sense, lights up. So that's my particular view of it, but I'd love to hear.
Well, I want to follow up with Richie in particular, because you have collaborated with the Dalai Lama, you have worked with a lot of Buddhist monks. How do you deal with this question of the connection with Buddhism, and more specifically this question of whether we're talking about some sort of spiritual practice here?
Well, you know, I very much agree with Jon about the nature of spiritual, and I think that he put it beautifully. So, you know, for me, I don't talk about spiritual because I don't really know what spiritual means. I think that what we're talking about is part of every human being's basic innate capacity.
Yeah.
We all have the capacity to be aware. We all have the capacity to express compassion and loving kindness. And you can call that whatever you want to call that. It doesn't really matter. But that is part of the basic human repertoire. In terms of the work that I've done with the Dalai Lama and with other Buddhist monks, from a scientific perspective, if we want to study these kinds of practices, we need a group of people who've been trained in a very standard way. And in some sense, we have simply taken advantage of samples of convenience, because these are individuals who've received extremely similar training. We can be sure that the kind of meditation practices that each person was doing was the same as the other person. And that's extremely important if you're going to bring in a group of people who are asked to engage in a specific kind of mental practice. You want them to have been trained in the same way. So we have just taken advantage of that kind of sample of convenience for that reason. There may be other traditions where there are comparable samples, in fact there are serious scientists who are studying practices that come from very different religious traditions.
But you are wading into what has traditionally been troubled waters. I mean, we're talking to some degree about mind-body medicine here, right? We're talking about the power
absolutely.
of the mind to alter the body, and I'm sure there are some scientists who would say this isn't real science. I mean, have you run up against that in some circles?
I mean, to be honest, I think most scientists today would agree that there are certain kinds of evidence now which I would say is incontrovertible evidence. I mean, we now know that there are certain psychosocial factors, for example, which can influence the course of certain physical illnesses. The data are absolutely bulletproof and compelling. You take an asthmatic and put an asthmatic in a stressful situation, and you will find an exacerbation of lung inflammation. And it could be measured objectively. I mean, that's a fact. When you begin to look at that and you then say, well, if that's really true, then the mind has to be involved. Because how else are those psychosocial influences from the world getting under the skin and actually influencing eosinophil infiltration in the lung, inflammatory responses in the lung? There is no other way other than through the mind and the brain. And I think that this kind of recognition has led to an increasing openness, and we now have the scientific tools to begin to study the mechanisms through which these kinds of influences may occur. And if they occur on the deleterious side, then they certainly invite the possibility that training the mind and changing one's relationship to these ruminations and to external stresses, that we can actually produce the flip side, if you will, and use the mind for beneficial purposes. The fact of neuroplasticity is silent with respect to whether it's good or bad. It's both. And if we take advantage of plasticity and use it, if you will, for promoting virtuous qualities, then it can be in the service of positive change.
Jon?
I'd just like to piggyback on that and say that, it's not just neuroplasticity. The science of the mind-body connection has evolved to the point where we now also understand what we used to think of as our chromosomes, our genetic inheritance, is no longer fixed. How our genes get expressed has everything to do with what we do, how we behave, what we eat, how intimate our relationships are, how we feel about ourselves, how much we exercise. So virtually everything that we're doing is in some way or another influencing the genes that get expressed, and many of the genes that are expressed under stress and so forth are inflammatory genes. They are genes that seem to be at the bottom of a whole lot of different kinds of chronic illnesses that people usually talk about as lifestyle-related illnesses, and that would also be cancer. And there's some very interesting evidence about that. And there's also the tips of all of our chromosomes are capped with these shoelace-type things called telomeres, and they shorten every time the cell divides. Those telomeres shorten some, and there's an enzyme that builds them back up. Under stress, the telomere degrade much faster. And there have been studies, in fact, Liz Blackburn won the Nobel Prize for this in 2009 for the discovery of telomeres and telomerase. But out of her lab, there have been studies of people with very severe chronic stress that's not going to go away because it has to do with parenting children with very chronic diseases, that while the stress can actually degrade and accelerate the telomere degradation rapidly, how you choose to be in relationship to your stress, the stressful conditions you live in, can actually build the telomeres back up. So we're in this dynamical flow, mind, body, speaking to each other, and just to say, the science is still in its infancy, but I have not actually heard from anybody in a very long time deep skepticism expressed about the validity of the mind-body connection or the scientific evidence behind it.
Yeah, and I would just say from a kind of different perspective, not so much the mind-body side of things, but from the cognitive augmentation field. How is it that we might be able to train the brain using other techniques? So, for example, computer-based training. I mean, many of you might have heard of like brain age or posit science. These are like lumosity. I mean, these are now publicly available for-profit possibilities for how people can train their own minds. So from that side of things, I mean, it's not that surprising. This sort of fits under that category. It's a different way to think about cognitive augmentation. So I don't know if it's also like a convergence of that happening around the same time that a lot of the mindfulness training studies and the study of their impact on the brain are happening.
Well, Amishi, I want to follow up on some of the work that you've been doing, which is fascinating. You have been working with soldiers in the U.S. military who are being deployed to go off to war zones, and you're with a project teaching them mindfulness techniques, right?
Right. So the project is and it has lots of people on the team, but I don't actually teach the mindfulness. In fact, the person teaching the mindfulness is actually kind of an exceptional person in and of herself. She's a former Army captain who also is an ordained Buddhist teacher who sat several retreats, and so she's got this, and she's a daughter of the American Revolution and a professor of security studies at Georgetown. She's really got every hat on, and she was sort of the perfect partner for this project to develop the kind of mindfulness training that would be appropriate for people that are in the military. She understood that side of it. She understood the mindfulness training side. So the project, from my side, it was an interest in seeing how is it that stress on the horizon, something that you know is coming that's very stressful, how does that degrade our ability to pay attention? And how might we protect against that by offering mindfulness training? And yeah, she trained 240 soldiers. Then they were deployed to Afghanistan. They came back this summer, and we've tracked them on their functioning after they've come back. So we looked at them before and after they got training, which is both were before they were deployed, and then they came back from deployment, and we tested them again. And pretty soon I'll be able to say what we found. Very soon, very soon. But I'll say that we're happy. Yeah. And in one project that we already did, which was with pre-deployment Marines, the results were quite interesting. It was a much smaller sample. But I'll tell you what we found with that project, because we were talking about the Olympians of meditation. We were talking about 40,000 hours. Well, in the project we did with pre-deployment Marines, what we found was that getting this training that Liz Stanley, the exceptional teacher that we had as a collaborator, offered, and doing as little as 12 minutes of practice a day actually helped these Marines keep their attention and working memory, this kind of added ability to pay attention over time, stable. If they practiced less than that or didn't practice at all or weren't offered the training, they all degraded in their functioning. So
this is an important point, actually, because I got into a big fight with Liz Stanley at some point because I was concerned that the meditation practice be misappropriated and used to actually create better killers. You know, the usual thing is like, okay, would a mindful sniper be a better sniper? Do you know what I'm saying? And she convinced me that actually it probably saves lives rather than makes people into better killers, because this working memory capacity, which doesn't degrade in the Marines, that's exactly what you want when you're in a counterinsurgency situation. Nobody's wearing uniforms and saying, hi, we're the enemy, we're over here, but these women and children over there, they are innocent, and so forth. So you've got a very, very rapidly changing, completely terrifying situation. And if you have experienced some kind of mental training that can keep you grounded, that may make the difference between, you know, just killing a whole bunch of innocent people and holding your fire appropriately. And so they're, morally speaking, and I think it's important to bring this up, and ethically speaking, it's important to understand that these are complex issues, but that the argument can be made that it's certainly not that all of a sudden we've gone over to the dark side and we're trying to, you know, train people to be better killers, but more to function effectively to do what needs to be done to save lives rather than to take lives.
yeah, I think that's an important point, that our ability to hold our own ethical code really relies on our working memory. If you cannot hold information in your mind in the moment that guides how you are to behave, you will just go back to, you know, will go in a reactive mode that could really be very problematic. And, you know, the data showed this sort of pattern, increased working memory, better attention. But what was really interesting was having The Marines themselves describe how things were different. For them, most of these Marines had gone 3 or 4 times before. And one of the medics that was trained actually said it so beautifully. He said, the last time I was there, everything was a blur. Everybody was a target. But this time I could see. That was a boy. That could be my son. And he really shifted in the way he was thinking and able to see. He was more discerning. And so that kind of that kind of pilot project really led us to think, let's give this a bigger shot with the larger population. The other one quick thing I'll say about the Marine study, which is very interesting, is that half the guys, we talked about people accepting or not accepting these practices, about half the Marines that we trained were really not into it. They were resistors, not going to do it. Liz tried her best, but they were just not interested in doing it, and they didn't practice. And we saw that just like the group that didn't get the training, they degraded in their working memory. But then when they came back, we tested them all again. And what I noticed is about half of that group that was the resistors actually got better after they came back from Iraq than before they left. And I was really scratching my head, like, what happened? Did being deployed give them a sense of purpose, and they were more aware, or what? They had some reason to really, I don't know. I was coming up with all kinds of hand-wavy stories. And before I went on to say any of this, I actually asked Liz. I said, is there anything that stands out about these guys? This group of people that look weird, they look better than before. And she said, oh yeah, they've been emailing and calling me from Iraq. They were calling her because their buddies, weren't getting the shakes, were able to function, were sleeping at night, and they wanted to know what that stuff was that she taught them beforehand. So they actually started practicing while they were deployed, which to me is always like a motivation that I should try to practice.
In just a few minutes, we're going to turn to the audience for questions there. But before we do that, we've been talking a lot about stress and how to reduce stress. Let me flip the question around to the other side. Is there a science of happiness?
I think that there is a growing science of happiness, and I think one of the things that we've learned about happiness from the kind of work that we've been talking about is that it is best to think of happiness as a skill. We normally don't think of happiness as a skill, but in fact, all of this kind of work would lead us to view it in this kind of way, and that if we practice it, we'll actually get better at it. One of the fascinating research areas that bears on these questions is work looking at the origins of certain kind of virtuous qualities, like being kind toward others, which turns out to be one of the strongest stimuli or situations which produces happiness in oneself. And it turns out that young infants have an innate propensity to express that kind of kindness toward others. They prefer watching those kinds of interactions. They prefer engaging in those kinds of interactions. And then stuff happens which mucks it up. In some sense, we can think of these qualities in the same way that we think of language. Language is clearly an innate capacity. All of us have the capacity for language, but in order for language to be expressed, we need to be raised in a linguistic community. And in order for happiness and for well-being and for other qualities like kindness and compassion to be expressed, we need to have it nurtured from early on. And if it's not nurtured, we can then use some of the practices that we're talking about to help familiarize ourselves with that place within each of us, which is there from the beginning, which has this as its core. And so I think these are some of the insights that we have been gleaning. And of course, there's a whole neurobiology to this that we've been learning as well, and that when people engage in these kinds of practices to strengthen these emotional attributes, there are changes that occur in the brain. And finally, let me just end this little riff by saying, we also know that happiness is related to health. And again, these data by now are really, really compelling. There's a group in the UK that has been working with it's called the Whitehall study, and it's a study of civil servants in British society, very large sample. And there are recent data from that study that clearly indicate that people's reports of their happiness are a strong predictor of all kinds of physical health outcomes. What we don't know is what the mechanisms for that are. But what we do know that there is some relationship, a positive relationship between happiness and health.
Jon?
I think there's one very important sort of take-home message from what Richie is saying. If you heard him say that happiness is a skill. Okay, so what that means, because we don't think of it as a skill, what do we think of it as? We think of it as a special state that I get to. And I think it's really important to recognize that happiness is not a single state. And mindfulness is not a single state either, nor is compassion. There are a whole range of different ways of being inside or under the umbrella of those kinds of things. And if you're hoping to actually increase your level of happiness, there are very unfortunate ways to go about it, where you're trying to basically grab for something that's going to make you happy, instead of recognizing that your happiness may actually already be here inside of yourself in the same way that your breath is, but you've never given it any attention, so it's a little bit atrophied. And as you, I mean, I'm sure that's, you know, within 30 seconds, if you held your breath, and then you took the next in-breath, the next in-breath would be a source of very, very great happiness. But we take hugely for granted that, you know, that who would be happy with the breath, you know? But if, as soon as you can't breathe, it's the only thing you care about. So there are a lot of different things like that. And very often it's that we're ignoring, we're not attending to those aspects of our own affective experience that actually supply meaning, supply deep connection, supply just that kind of sense of interconnectedness that truly lies at the bottom of well-being and happiness.
Let's go to the audience now.
First of all, thank you for the question. It's an absolutely wonderful question. There are some very, very deep correlates, in my view, that, you know, we were talking about mind-body interconnectedness. But there's more than just mind and body. There's also what we call the body politic. The army, as we were talking about, you know, is like, you could think of it as the immune system of the body politic or of the nation or whatever you. So we call ourselves as a species Homo sapiens sapiens, which in Latin is from the verb sapere, which means to taste, sense, or to know, non-cognitive knowing, awareness. So we're the species that knows and knows that it knows, awareness and meta-awareness. But I don't think so, not yet. We haven't really grown in fully to the name that we're giving ourselves. And what's being suggested, to some degree, is that this is one door in, and then as you don't have to practice watching your breath for 15,000 hours, but over relatively short periods of time, MBSR is even 8 weeks, your view can rotate, it can shift, it's like a rotation in consciousness, and all of a sudden what you've been doing for 20 or 30 years, you see in a new light. That's a kind of insight, that's a revelation. And this is happening in society now. It's happening, I don't know if you know the work of Tim Ryan, who's a congressperson from the 17th Congressional District in Ohio, but he just wrote a book called The Mindful Nation, in which he speaks about just this kind of thing, that this has profound implications for our society and how we conduct ourselves. And you know, the Chinese have a 1,500-year history of mindfulness, and yet when they see the word mindfulness written in Chinese, the characters for mindfulness, they read it as thinking. It's been eradicated from the mainstream of their culture. Imagine if China got back in touch with its own deep wisdom roots in this way, to say nothing of Taoism and so forth. It could potentially have vast economic consequences, vast consequences for Tibet, vast consequences for all of the minorities in China. And this is true for many, many different countries. Richie was mentioning the UK, that, you know, there's a professor there, Lord Richard Layard, Sir Richard Layard, who is a member of the House of Lords, and he's a a macroeconomist, and he is actually trying to develop new metrics for beyond the gross domestic product for the health of the society of the UK. And what are they looking at? They're looking at ways to measure happiness and well-being and a sense of connectedness. So this is something that is moving into the body politic in many, many different ways.
With regard to using a measure of 40 hertz activity to feed back to a person to try to enhance this state, if you will, I would say that if we really understood what the brain was doing when it was expressing this kind of awareness, and we really had a good measure of the global brain state that occurred, then maybe we could try something like that to actually use in a bio or neurofeedback context. But I would say at this point in time, it's a little bit of hubris to think that we actually understand something about this. I think that for that reason, these applications are quite premature. Now, if they are helping people, certainly I think that's wonderful, and they may be genuinely helping people, but they may not be operating through the mechanisms that the individuals who've designed these apps think they are, because they've never been seriously evaluated. With regard to using technology, however, though, I'm a big fan of that. We actually are doing a major study now in our lab that's actually funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop apps to cultivate mindfulness and kindness in children. And the origin of this is quite interesting because it really came about after a meeting that we had in Washington, D.C. with the Dalai Lama, it was on the theme of education, and in the last session, I threw out a line saying game manufacturers should take this kind of work seriously, and instead of developing games that cultivate aggression and violence, why not develop games to cultivate kindness and compassion? And without filling in all the blanks, we ended up in having an opportunity to work with some game designers to do this. And so we will be evaluating it, but it does not use neurofeedback. It uses other kinds of principles, but we are evaluating the impact that these games have on the brain. And this actually also is a good place for me to mention something, a broader point in response to another question. It doesn't take thousands of hours to change the brain. That's a myth, and it's not true. In fact, there are recent data that show that there are structural changes that can be produced in the brain from 1.5 hours of training. Structural changes, not just functional changes. So the structure of our brains are continuously being dynamically modulated. If you have a warm-hearted conversation with a loved one in the morning, the structure of your brain is probably being changed by that. So our brains are constantly being dynamically modulated. And knowing that, I think, should give us all an impetus to change our brains in healthier ways. Since they're being changed wittingly or unwittingly, we might as well wittingly do it in a way that is more salubrious.
So there's a couple of published studies now that have looked at the impact of mindfulness training for attention. I can talk about the one we did in my own lab. And what we did is we recruited adults with ADD and we didn't tell them to change their typical, whatever clinical treatment they were having, they continued. And what was very interesting was the way in which that mindfulness course was constructed and offered was very different than sort of the standard manualized versions of mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example. So my collaborator that was at the University of Pennsylvania, Michael Boehm, he actually, the first day of class, their exercise, their homework for the week was a 1-minute mindfulness exercise. And what they did during that minute was listen to this recording, which was silence for a minute, except for every 10 seconds there was a little ding, ding, and that was it. That was the exercise, and the instruction was bring your attention back to the here and now when you hear the ding. And it was so funny because people said they just played it all day long. At work, they just constantly, and it was great because every 10 seconds or so, they'd get back to being in the present moment. What we found was that it did improve their ability to protect against mind wandering and improved their attention. And what was very interesting also was that they said that they didn't change the amount of medication, but they were better able to use it. So they were better able to know when the Adderall had worn off, and maybe now it's time to take it again. So something shifted, and there was such a creative group of people. I never received so many cards, gifts, letters, and paintings after this study. It was an amazing project. So I guess we're starting to learn that it is helpful, and that there is some data on it.
So let me just respond directly to your question very, very briefly. We can spend hours on it, but the knee-jerk reaction from conventional modern neuroscience is to say that the mind is an emergent property of the brain, or that the mind is simply another way of talking about the brain, or that the mind is what the brain does. Those are all phrases that you will see in the standard neuroscientific literature. What I try to teach my students is that we have no friggin' idea. We are really at such an early stage in this work, and there are so many deep unanswered questions, and we need to do everything we can to resist giving a knee-jerk reaction.
We did 4 years worth of work in the Massachusetts Department of Corrections with over 1,200 inmates and trained them in these kinds of things with the aim of doing really definitive recidivism long-term study to see what happens when they get out, and then do they re-offend and so forth. Those studies are actually very, very difficult to do. So we weren't able to show that, but we did show major changes in people, including on the hostility index that's used on the MMPI. Prison is the most hostile place on the planet, and yet people were finding different ways to be in relationship to hostility and showing reductions in hostility. And there are also other places that are studying mindfulness of one kind or another, meditation practices in prison. And I think the overall evidence, it's not really scientifically based, but sort of anecdotally seems to be that very much you can, sort of have people shift their relationship to their past actions and deeds, and reconfigure their moral coordinate system for the future. Not everybody, but if you can do that, and it's a huge question in our society because we imprison more people in the United States than any other country on the planet, including South Africa during apartheid and the USSR during the Soviet era. The United States imprisons more people than anybody else on a percentage basis. So, and there are huge costs on a lot of different levels to that beyond the economic costs. So it really is a wonderful question that you've asked that, and I think we do need to research it in much more rigorous ways, and much better funded than we were funded to do it.
We could go on, but we should wrap it up here. I want to thank everyone for not just coming to this session, but for those of you who have come to the other sessions. This has been a fantastic 4-part series, The Emerging Science of Consciousness. I want to thank our partners, the New York Academy of Sciences, the Newer Foundation. If you want to see the webcast of the previous sessions, they are all on the website of the Newer Foundation. This will be on there as well. And I want to thank especially our wonderful, wonderful panelists. Thank you.